Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week, after being derailed by illness and the welcome inconvenience of the Labor Day weekend, as well as a host of other troubles, we're finally wrapping up our discussion of Nnedi Okorafor's Binti series with a brief look at the short story Sacred Fire, which was written for and included in the bound trilogy of novellas, and then we'll move on to discuss Harmony and Harmonizers, what happens at Saturn, and much more besides. Before we get to Sacred Fire, though, I know we have some new listeners joining us for this series, so I thought it would help to circle back to a point that I have made previously, but which is particularly important when we consider this short story and its spot in the timeline. We live in an era of expanded intellectual property, of entire fictional universes of proper nouns arrayed for our entertainment, combined in new clusters to generate stories clacked together like toys to make conflict. In order to grow these universes, we expand in space, we go wider, we go deeper, and we expand in time. We go before, we go after. And there's a temptation, because on some level we care about the internal consistency of these fictional worlds, to respect the internal chronology of a given story as it's presented to us, and giving that internal chronology priority over the real-world timeline of production. I talked a lot about Star Wars in the last episode, so let's skip an account of George Lucas's prequel trilogy, and, in the name of balance, we'll also skip over the many prequel series in the Star Trek canon too, and look at the issue in a more general way. The truth is this: stories are created and stories are consumed in linear time. That's inescapable. Every story is the product of a particular set of circumstances, and when you go back to write a story which comes earlier in the timeline, you are still the person who has already written those later stories. You're still building on the foundation of the future. And this isn't a bad thing, to be clear. This isn't an argument against prequels. I am not saying, though some might, that prequels are definitionally not the important part of the story. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that the phenomenological timeline of production creates conditions in which subsequent stories are themselves produced. The person that you are today can't write the story that you could have written yesterday, just as the person that you were yesterday couldn't write the story that you can write today or tomorrow or next week. You can always, in my experience, spot the seams when the timeline of production does not match that internal chronology. And look, there's always a certain good nature to submission to the will of the author in the reading process. If we sit down and read the pages of a novel in a random order, I don't think that we would assume we had really read the story that the author intended. There's a degree of good faith required here on both sides, which is to say that we're not adopting this reading order arbitrarily or because it's antagonistic to the presence of the author in our consumption of the story, but because it's more interesting to see the choices that the author makes in order. And, I genuinely believe, because it's more generative, because it gives us more to talk about. I'll forestall the rest of this discussion here, because next week we're going to be looking at Brian Michael Bendis' retelling of the origins of Spider-Man, and nothing is more produced in linear time than a comic from the year 2000 trying to be cool and definitive, let me tell you. This takes us to Sacred Fire, a somewhat slight short story set between the first and second Binti novellas. It's an opportunity for Okorafor to sketch a little more of Uni, to spend some time in the early days of Binti's first year at the school, still haunted by the events of the first novella. It introduces us to a couple of supporting characters that we, of course, displaced in the timeline, have already met, and distills down a really interesting and important thematic contrast, which is more fully, but less conclusively perhaps, explored in The Night Masquerade. It feels like a very organic development of those themes, as well as giving us, as I say, a chance to revisit characters, particularly Haifa, who proved popular with readers. So we open this short story with an accounting of Binti's emotional state, weeks into her time at the university. Regarded with fear and with suspicion by many of her peers, blamed by Heru's family for his death on Third Fish, estranged from her own family, Binti is discovering that simply being a student at Uni isn't allowing her to heal. So she undertakes a kind of personal, semi-secular pilgrimage into the desert, where she encounters two alien species, the Algaza insects and the bat-like Usu Ogu. And if the novel is, as I say, perhaps a little slight, it's still a good read, and Okorafor finds novel perspectives for Binti in this kind of emotional setting, this kind of emotional range. And there's something to be said, I think, to wander away from this specific story for just a moment. There's something to be said for the pleasure of a familiar world, or perhaps more appropriately in this case, the discovery of an unfamiliar world in the company of familiar characters. Stories offer different kinds of rewards to the reader, sometimes character and human insight, sometimes theme and philosophy, sometimes plot and excitement, sometimes merely the comfort of another place, another world. Usually some combination of all of those qualities and more besides. I myself am generally less motivated by that comfort than I am by plot or by theme, but that's just personal preference. I know readers who love to revisit Narnia every Christmas or who dip back into Jane Eyre every fall just to enjoy that feeling of being transported to a familiar world. And Okorafor certainly transports, though I'll certainly concede that continuing in the African Jujuist mode that the second and third novellas really embrace, there is perhaps less rigorous and technical development of Umzuyuni than science fiction readers might hope for. One of the most interesting details that we get early in this story is during our reintroduction to Haifa and Binti's reflection on how the Himba view transness. The Oji Himba term that Binti uses, Eanda Orutso, is actually a combination of the words used to describe the mother's matrilineal clan and the father's patrilineal clan. Every Himba person has two clan identities, and that is reflected in the language. This feminine-masculine duality is in keeping, of course, with the themes Okorafor explores, as is the notion of aligning with one's true identity. Quote, "Amongst the Himba, you were what you knew you were once you knew what you were, and that was that," to quote my village's chief, Kapika. I wondered if all the people of the Kush communities were as open about alignment as Haifa. End quote. We don't really have a lot of fuel for speculation here, except that Haifa is clearly more well-adjusted, more generous, and more welcoming of others than most of the Kush characters that we meet in the course of the story. And it's tempting to read her transition, her aligning, as something which has given her a more just and generous perspective. And if that's true, then we're invited, I think, to compare Haifa's experience and Binti's transformation after her encounter with the Meduse. We'll circle back to alignment and its metaphorical consonance with harmony in just a little while. I think it's fair to say that Oku suffers the most from the positioning of this story between the first and second novellas because there's just no space to really develop its characterization. Haifa decides to adopt Binti as a friend without any real reciprocity in the first instance, which at least feels true to the adolescent experience somewhat, and I'll say the bear remains an intriguing enigma, but Haifa gets the majority of characterization alongside Binti herself. It's out in the desert with the reveal of the Algatza bugs planted in Binti's satchel as a mean-spirited prank that we get the theme of the piece. These scarab-like insects are agents of chaos in the contained space of a dorm room, but Binti has coincidentally taken them to where they are supposed to be. Here, in the open desert, they gather round the fire, then fly away on their own. Quote, "A bird can't fly in a cage?" I said. It was one of my ex-best friend Dele's favorite quotes. The bear and I looked at the night sky for a little longer, and when nothing else buzzed or glinted in the firelight, we went into the tent. I fell asleep minutes after drinking a cup of capture station water. I slept deep, and I slept well. The desert always has the answers. End quote. This, then, is an interesting development in Okorafor's argument about being and the essential nature of the self. Yes, being requires action, but this is also a recognition that circumstances can constrain you, can transform your true nature into even something destructive. Binti stranded on Earth would have been like the Algaza in the dorm room, out of place, and in the expression of otherwise virtuous qualities, harmful to their surroundings. This is contrasted with the brief encounter Binti has the following morning with the Usu Ogu, which is eating the shells left behind by the Algaza. Quote, "I'm Binti," I said. "Who are you?" "Usu Ogu are Usu Ogu," it said. "It only matters what I do." "And what do you do?" I asked. "I fly." And with that, it flew into the air, circled the tent once, turned sideways and zipped through the closed tent flap. My current broke from the Usu Ogu the moment it was outside. The flap opened again, this time wide. "Simple-minded foolish thing," Oku said as it entered. "Of course it matters who you are." End quote. And I'll admit, I'm not very clear on why Oku feels so strongly that identity is a fixed, rigid thing, except that in this moment it gives Binti something to push back against. This conversation is a neat encapsulation of many of the themes that we discussed in the last episode. We are what we do. Identity is realized in action. What's striking here, particularly alongside our treatment of the capital P people of Uni, is that the philosophy and politics of identity apply from the simplest animals of the desert to the students and faculty of the university itself and beyond. This isn't something that's unique to Binti or which applies disproportionately to Binti, which, to be fair, is a conclusion with which the Night Masquerade could have left us, but is rather an essential part of all living things. This is, I think, the most intentional development of Okorafor's philosophical schema, which, as short and straightforward as Sacred Fire is, gives us a good segue out into a broader discussion of the Binti series. And we're going to begin with an email from listener Wes, who asks with a commendable efficiency, Wes, thank you for this, quote, "What's with the Saturn aliens? I feel like I'm missing something," end quote. And I know the feeling, because I spent more than a little time combing through the last novella looking for something more, but I think that the Saturn aliens are ultimately exactly what they seem to be, which is not to say that we cannot make what is, to me at least, an interesting inference here. Binti dreams, or has visions, of being in space twice in the second novella, and then again in the third. The voice, which, quote, "spoke in the dialect of my family," end quote, seems dissatisfied throughout when Binti gives it her name and tells her there is more. It's only after her death and resurrection, when her name has expanded to include Medusa, Nnedi, New Fish, that the aliens speak to her fully. So on the one hand, we've been foreshadowing this for 2 novellas, and it seems like the culmination of Binti's integration of her own identity yields this terminal punctuation. But on the other hand, it turns out that these aliens just want a recommendation from someone with a deconstructed Zinaraya Idan on whether or not Uni is good. Quote, "And just like that, the dust and debris of Saturn was simply dust and debris again. A recommendation, that's all they needed. It was so anticlimactic. Not that I was complaining," end quote. So the novel acknowledges this deflationary move, this anticlimax. The aliens in the rings of Saturn are using Binti like Yelp or Rate My Professor. But I think that there is something really interesting happening just under the surface here. And to get to that, we have to consider the timeline. Binti has been having visions of this place, of these aliens, since the beginning of the second novella. They contact her through the Idan, the Zinaraya object, the lowercase z Zinaraya object, which indicates the technology of the golden aliens rather than the aliens themselves. The Zinaraya object is the golden ball at the heart of the Idan. The layers around it, as the Saturn aliens tell us, are packaging. It's interesting, therefore, that Binti dreams of Saturn's rings before she disassembles the Idan, right before she sees the Night Masquerade for the first time. Now, maybe that's not an important distinction, but we do know that the Saturnian aliens don't accept Binti's name until it is complete. That is, until she has recognized and integrated the Medusa, the Nnedi, and the New Fish parts of herself. But the first dreams of Saturn occur before she even knows about the Nnedi, and certainly before she's been resurrected by New Fish, which might lead us to wonder how the Saturnian aliens know who Binti will be someday. When she talks with them, though, they admit, quote, "We're people of time and space. We move about experiencing, collecting, becoming more. This is the philosophy and culture of our equation," end quote. And is it possible that this specificity, that they are people of time and space who move about, indicate that these aliens aren't limited to linear time? When Binti challenges them on calling her, they respond, "Did we call you here?" And a moment later confirm, "Okay, we called you, yes." Do they know what Binti's name should be because they meet her here and now before they, in their timeline, invite her or call to her? And this is important, particularly because it's the dream of Saturn that compels Munyi and Oku to take Binti's body aboard New Fish in the first place. It is because she has visions of this time and this place that she is resurrected. It's because of the visions that she becomes bonded with New Fish and completes her name. It's more than just a deflationary move, I think. It's more than just an anticlimax, even if that is how it reads in the moment. My interpretation is that this is a stable time loop, predicated not just on Binti's voyage to the rings of Saturn, but on her death and resurrection, because had she not been resurrected, her name would not be all that it is. So I know that it's a bit of a leap, and perhaps there are better alternate explanations, but to me, we're witnessing the fulfillment of a series of events which lead directly to Binti's return. The Uni question may be sincere, but it may also be a cover story by aliens who know more than they admit and who primarily want to intervene and save Binti's life for reasons, I admit, which are no more transparent to us now than they were before. Wes, I hope that helps. Let me know what you think. The brilliant Andrea wrote over on the Next Word Discord, quote, "Can we explore what the author is saying about what makes a harmonizer? I've been thinking about how Binti's physical changes into other beings create understanding and compassion. Is that a key element for harmonizing and creating peace?" End quote. And thanks, Andrea. I think this is an excellent question. And it points to a real issue that I have had reading this trilogy, this series of novellas, namely knowing how deeply to read and how deeply to interpret the depictions that we get of the Himba people, and to a lesser extent the Enyi Zinaraya both. This comes at a basic level from an ignorance about the real Himba people and what we might assume or infer about their beliefs. This is a feature, not a bug, of the African futurist setting. Okorafor doesn't hold our hands when it comes to building out the world speculatively, because that would require the acknowledgement of, and honestly the narrative submission to, a non-African perspective. So it's deliberate, but it does make getting to the heart of the matter a little more challenging. I stumbled into this a little during our discussion of the first novella when I mentioned that the seven were obviously some kind of ancestor spirits worshipped by the Himba, though now I'm not at all sure that that is true, or at least not entirely true. Let's put a pin in the seven for now, though, and consider what we know of the Himba so that we can figure out exactly what Okorafor means when she talks about harmonizing. Let's consider this exchange from the beginning of the first novella when Binti faces the Kush customs officer and discusses her Adan before boarding third fish. Quote, "Your identity reads you're a harmonizer, a masterful one who builds some of the finest astrolabes," he said. "But this object isn't an astrolabe. Did you build it? And how can you build something and not know what it's made of?" "I didn't build it," I said. "Who did?" It's just an old thing," I said. "It has no math or current. It's just an inert computative apparatus that I carry for good luck." This was partially a lie, but even I didn't know exactly what it could and couldn't do. End quote. So, a masterful harmonizer who builds some of the finest astrolabes. So there's a connection between these two things, and Binti implies by noting the absence of current and math in the Adan that harmonizing and astrolabes have something to do with current, what Binti's mother will much later equate to life force. This is casually made explicit even right there in the first novella, though I'll admit I didn't catch it until maybe my third reading, when Binti notes, quote, "And so I became a master harmonizer by the age of 12. I could communicate with spirit flow and convince them to become one current." End quote. So current is a product of harmonized spirit flow, and if we squint a little here, we can fold in Binti's mother's description and make it comprehensible. There is a natural flow of spirit in the world, and harmonizers can pull that together to make current, though harmonizers are clearly not the only source of current. Current, electricity, is everywhere. It seems to be naturally occurring, but harmonizers can summon it, draw it forth, and to some extent at least compel it. Later in the series, we'll learn that the ability to make astrolabes is unique to the Himba people. Quote, "The Himba people are the creators and makers of astrolabes, devices of communication," end quote. Which I guess doesn't technically rule out the possibility that other people can make astrolabes, just that they were created, invented by the Himba people. Astrolabes are used, we are told, by the Kush and by every resident alien race at Uni. The only people who don't use astrolabes, we're explicitly told, are the Meduse because they are too proud. Astrolabes allow for instant communication across vast distances, have these circular screens, function as translators, as flashlights, as medical alerts, as projectors. They store information, as Binti says when her own astrolabe breaks. Quote, "Astrolabes were the only object that also carried the full record of your entire life on it. You, your family, and all forecasts of your future." End quote. Astrolabes, it seems pretty certain, are a product of the contact between the Himba people and the Zinaraya. If we think of the flashbacks in the third novella, beginning with Conde's first glimpse of the golden aliens, we see no hint of currents, of harmonizing, of advanced technology, at least before the second flashback, when we're told by the elders, including Take a Good Position, that Conde is now acting like a girl possessed, seeing things that are not there. Quote, "My grandson said it was like they put alien internet in her brain," another elder said, and quote. Now, this is certainly recognizable from Binti's subsequent descriptions of the Zinariah, the lowercase z Zinariah technology, and her own interactions with that system, which seems to work as an augmented reality system, which they manipulate in part with their hands, kind of like the holographic computer interfaces in Minority Report or in the Iron Man movies, except visible only to the person operating the system. And we'll note that the first time Binti uses the Zinariah technology to contact her father, she says it's like an astrolabe, but more primitive. And that's important because I think it would be tempting, as science fiction readers in particular, to read the astrolabe as a simplified, humanified instance of alien technology. But that doesn't seem to be true. We also learn that the Zinariah is nanotech, that it is indivisible from the user. And, well, that idea of something indivisible from the self, but not the self, of course, reminds us of our many conversations about dualism in the course of this series. The astrolabe itself is also separate, but consider Binti's feelings when her own astrolabe breaks. There is still a sense of self about it, a sense that we imbue this object with our own identity, which I can tell you, as someone who has witnessed the death of laptops and cell phones over the years, feels relatable. So let's pause here to consider the timeline too, because there's some contradiction here. The Zinariah meets Conde when she steps outside late in the evening for a cigarette, when she's looking at her phone. But when Binti goes into the deep desert and talks with her grandmother, she is told, well, quote, "You're an interesting people who have been on these lands for generations, but you're a young people. The Nnedi Zinariah are old Africans. And contrary to what you believe, we have technology that puts yours to shame, and we've had it for centuries." She paused, letting this news sink in. It wasn't sinking into me easily. All that she said was so contrary to all that I had been taught that I began to feel a little dizzy. "We didn't create it, though," she continued. "It was brought to us by the Zinariah. Those who were there documented the Zinariah times, but those files were kept on paper, and paper does not last. So all we really know is what elders read, and then what the elders after those elders remembered, and then what the next elders remembered, and so on. The Zinariah came to us in the desert. They were a golden people who glinted in the sun. They were solar and had landed in Earth's desert to rest and refuel on their way to Uni. I couldn't control myself. "What?" I shrieked. She chuckled. "Yes, we desert people knew of Uni before the other people on Earth even had mobile phones." End quote. So, is the flashback scene with Conde the first coming of the Zinariah to Earth? Or have the golden aliens made prior contact with the Nnedi Zinariah out in the desert? I think the key to this is the explanation that Binti's grandmother gives about paper records. Paper decays, so the oral tradition is used instead. But the problem with the oral tradition is that there's no checksum. There's no way of verifying the internal integrity of that information. Stories can be made whatever you want stories to be. It seems, given the narrative authority of the flashback, that the Zinariah went first to the Himba people, and at some point the Himba people exiled the Nnedi Zinariah, removing the visible users of the lowercase z Zinariah technology from their own population. We can be pretty confident of this, I think, because of the connection between astrolabes and Zinariah. Both Binti and her grandmother note the similarity, and the specific detail that the Zinariah recodes the DNA of the target and is passed on to the next generation, which is significant when we think about the emphasis that is put on Binti's skill as a harmonizer and her father's similar skill. This interpretation is confirmed, I think, by Binti's reflection at the end of the third novella, right before contacting the aforementioned aliens around Saturn. Binti says, quote, "I thought about the Zinariah. They'd come to a quiet part of Africa where the people lived very close to the desert, close and isolated enough that the people in those small communities knew how to keep a secret, and thus the rest of the world never knew of the tall, humanoid, gold people who loved the way the sun reacted with Earth's atmosphere there. They saw this small patch of Earth as a vacation spot, and the people they met didn't mind. Their friendship started with a girl named Conde. In many ways, she was like me. What Conde started had eventually made the people in this small town more, made the Zinariah more." End quote. So the Himba came first, despite what Binti's grandmother believes. And this, I think, isn't a lie that is told to Binti, but is a part of the cultural identity of the Enya Zinaraya, because, as we've discussed, the first thing that a culture does is protect and perpetuate itself, and it does so primarily by defining and guarding the boundaries between us and them. This idea of exclusive cultural identity is seen throughout the series. From the Himba themselves to the Enyi Zinaraya, from the Kush to the Meduse, we see the potential for more, though. That potential is represented by Umza University, and that's the hope for the future. So all of this leads us to the conclusion that the ability to see and manipulate current, and by extension the ability to harmonize, comes from the Himba contact with the Zinaraya, not necessarily because it is directly imparted, but because contact between cultures, the crossing of boundaries, the sharing of natures, empowers both sides. In a sense, the passing of the Zinaraya technology to the Himba people, first by nanotech and then by DNA alteration, isn't a categorically different thing than Binti's transformation by the Meduse, which I mentioned to emphasize how deeply this idea of intercommunication, of intercultural contact, is embedded in the foundation of Okorafor's work. This, ultimately, is what Binti represents, the best fusion of Himba, of Enyi Zinaraya, of Meduse, and of, spaceship. Okorafor here, it seems to me, is arguing in favor of cultural heterogeneity, of various cultural identities overlapping and coexisting even within the individual, enriching and being enriched by the others. And it doesn't take much, of course, to see the applicability and utility of that philosophy in the context of modern Africa, in the context of the modern world as a whole. The means by which a person interacts with the current varies from individual to individual. Binti's mother can see the current outright, but as Binti makes clear in the final confrontation with the Kush and the Meduse, quote, I steadied myself. I pulled from deep within me, from the earth beneath my feet, from what I could reach beyond the earth above. Because I was a master harmonizer and my path was through mathematics, I took what came and felt it as numbers, absorbed it as math, and when I spoke, I breathed it out. End quote. So, mathematics, as exemplified by Binti, by Professor Okpala, by the other students who learn to tree at Umza Uni, mathematics is one of the ways to access the current, to draw it forth, to wield it, but it is not the only way. One more clarifying note here. That same excerpt confirms what we have inferred in the series as a whole, and what is also strongly suggested by Binti's mother. The current is naturally occurring. It exists within Binti, within the earth, within all aspects of the natural world. It's not the force. So we have the current, and we have the means of interacting with the current. We have various means of interacting with the current, and that leaves us with this tantalizing question: what is harmonizing? Well, we know that it manifests itself in different ways. Mwinyi is a harmonizer, we're told, taught by an elephant to communicate with animals. Quote, the type of harmonizer one was depended on one's teacher's worldview. That's what Binti says early in the third novella. This explains Binti's skill as a master harmonizer when it comes to making astrolabes, because she learned directly from her father and is expected to someday take over his shop. But harmonizing is also what empowers Binti to communicate with the Meduse following the attack on Third Fish, as she says to Okwu, quote, I'm a master harmonizer. That's why I'm going to Umza Uni. I'm the best of the best, Okwu. I can create harmony anywhere. End quote. A harmony comes to English from the Latin harmonia, meaning a joining or a concord. We're most familiar with the musical meaning of the word, I suppose, in which multiple musical notes can overlay one another to create a pleasant chord, which is its own kind of cultural heterogeneity when you think about it. These individual notes are not changed, but in combination, they become more than the constituent parts. This is echoed specifically at the beginning of the second novella, when we get a rare example of what harmonizing actually is in practice. Quote, Professor Okpala would certainly approve. A harmonizer harmonized. Bringing Okwu in peace to the land of the people its people had fought would be one of the 10 good deeds Okpala had insisted I perform within the academic cycle as part of being a good math student. End quote. So, yes, harmonizers do something with the current, but it's something that carries with it, or at least can carry with it, a moral dimension. Harmonizing isn't just using current, it is a good act. All of which is a very long way of saying that it isn't completely clear what harmonizing is. It is a gift given to the Himba by the Zenariah or emergent in the Himba because of their contact with the Zenariah. It's a manipulation of the current, which is the life force of all things. And of course, a superficial read of the metaphor suggests coherence, concordance, heterogeneity. That is, it creates a harmony, but not a unity, which is an important distinction. And that harmonizing is itself a moral good. But we're left with questions. Is Binti's manifestation of the power of Himba culture a kind of harmonization, or is it a different thing? If so, how do we read the change of heart experienced by the Kush king and the Meduse chief? One possible interpretation is that it's a domination, that it's an overwriting of their personalities in accordance with Binti's will, but that doesn't feel true to the text. A more generous reading might suggest that Binti is restoring a harmony to the disharmonious, which would, to me, suggest a deeper moral framework for the novel as a whole. That is, that peace and coexistence and the benevolent, generous intermingling of culture is the natural harmonious state of the world, and that conflict is a product of forced disharmony, in some cases, potentially in all cases, a product of violence. That seems to me to be the philosophical heart of these stories. That seems to me to be what Okorafor is aiming for, and I have to say, of course, that it's a philosophy with which I am myself harmonious. That's a lot, and I'm not sure that we've covered all of it. So if you have more specific questions, or if you have indeed your own thoughts, then please come and join me and join Andrea over on the Next Word Discord. That's patreon.com/nextword to pledge your support, to throw me a couple of bucks to help me keep making this podcast, and to get access to that Discord server where great conversations happen. One more question then before we wrap up. Bill writes, providing me with my own segue, which is wonderful. Quote, on an unrelated note, I'm curious about your reading habits. No matter what you're discussing on the podcast, you seem to have a knowledge of the area. Is that just research, or do you read everything? Loving the show, hanging on, hoping for more horror. Clive Barker, maybe, end quote. And you know, Bill, it's funny that you should mention Clive Barker, because his work is an excellent example of my weird reading habits. I have read one Clive Barker book, and it's The Great and Secret Show, which I think is not only not recognized as one of his best, but certainly not recognized as one of his most popular. But I remember enjoying it, and I would love to return to Clive Barker for more. I tend to read in seasons. I tend to become fascinated by a particular idea or setting or technique, and then I will read 2, 3, 4, 5 books in that area before moving on to something new. So recently I was reading a series of portal fantasies, including the work of Guy Kay, the Fionavar Tapestry series, which is not like objectively good, I think, but makes all kind of wild presumptions about what the reader expects and wants, and betrays over and again what Kay is really interested in and what he's not. Guy Kay, a particularly interesting figure. He worked very closely with Christopher Tolkien on the compilation of his father's work after his death. He was a student of philosophy, I think, at the University of Manitoba, and contributed a great deal of assistance in the preparation of what would become the published Silmarillion. So I'm reading that partly because I'm working on a portal fantasy novel myself, and partly because I was a little dissatisfied reading some recent portal fantasy stories too. I just finished rereading Mark Frost's excellent Secret History of Twin Peaks and Twin Peaks: The Final Dossier, because it's almost October. That means it's almost Twin Peaks season again. And because I've also been thinking a lot about the role of independent author functions working in a collaborative schema. For those of you who don't know, the Secret History and the Final Dossier are basically Mark Frost's attempt to reconcile and to systematize the history and mythology of Twin Peaks, things which David Lynch, his co-creator on that show, actively refused to do in the context of the show itself. It's a really interesting work of expanded and very intentional world building. I think the next adventure will start with a reread of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, and then I'll continue through to the rest of the Southern Reach trilogy, which I have not read yet, but which promises, I think, to be a fairly brief read. And of course, I'm very, very deep into Tolkien at the moment in advance of the Silmarillion series that we're going to start in a few weeks. I also do a lot of reading oriented around the podcast. I've been reading Nnedi Okorafor's Leviathan as background for the bonus episode on District 9. And I wind up, much less so in this unit, actually, because Binti is relatively new and hasn't really been discussed that much. But I usually wind up reading a lot of academic work on the novel we're studying, just as a way of seeing what the critical response is. I meant to keep track during the Great Expectations unit, but the extra reading, was definitely in the hundreds of pages and possibly in the many hundreds of pages by the time I was done with that long unit. I've also been reading a series of essays lately on Richard Linklater's Before trilogy because I have an upcoming podcast dedicated to that series. I'm immersing myself in everything surrounding those 3 films. I'll recommend this book specifically, actually. It is called Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, Before Midnight, A Philosophical Exploration. It is part of a series of books called Okorafor on Film. It's edited by Hans Mays and Katrin Schaubruck. There's another book in that series dedicated to David Lynch's Mulholland Drive as well, which I'm very tempted by. That might turn out to be a Christmas present to myself when the time comes. All of which is to say, I suppose, realizing that I've wandered pretty far away from the question, that I read generally quite widely. I like to have at least a familiarity with all the major genres and with every major subgenre within those, I guess, and try to keep up too with modern developments in the literary marketplace. I think it behooves us all to kind of try to be as broadly read as possible. And of course, as a part of that, I'm actively trying to read more books not written by straight white dudes. But otherwise, I end up following my curiosity. That seems to be the most rewarding way of reading for me. So thank you, Bill, for that question. And yes, more horror. Our schedule is a little soft. I'm sure you can tell by how delayed this particular episode was. As I said, illness and the Labor Day weekend conspired against my production of this episode, as well as a host of other minor inconveniences. But I am hoping that moving forward, we'll be able to do something a little more solid. And to that end, I'm announcing a small shift in our format here on Stars and Swords, partly prompted by the fact that we will be moving forward to cover Spider-Man comics for the next 2 episodes here on the show. The change is going to be this. This podcast is now going to be broadcast live at a certain time. That is to say, Monday evenings at 8 p.m. Central Time. I know that's going to be convenient for some of you. I know it's going to be wildly inconvenient for others of you. That's where we're going to start. I may well move that around in the future just to give everyone an opportunity to come and hang out live. The podcast, as it is released, will be no different. It will probably come with a PDF of slides that I will put up during the live broadcast. That live broadcast will crucially take place on the aforementioned Next Word Discord server. So if you would like to hang out with me live while I discuss Spider-Man, starting Monday, the 16th of September at 8 p.m. Central Time, I'll put up all of these details in a post over on the website too. If you'd like to join me live, head on over to patreon.com/nextword, pledge your support, get access to the Discord, come hang out live. If you would prefer to not join me live and just have the podcast after the fact, then rest assured the podcast experience will be almost exactly the same, but much more reliable in terms of its production and release. That's what we're putting in place for Spider-Man and, of course, for the extended Silmarillion series, which will follow thereafter. Stay tuned to starsandswords.com for more information. Thanks to everyone who has already headed over to the Patreon page to pledge your support. I really appreciate it. It makes all of this possible. Stay tuned too within the next couple of days for my bonus episode on District 9, our supplemental read for the Binti series, a real way of looking at the contrast between African futurism in the Okorafor style and Afrofuturism, and even then a more specific kind of Afrofuturism in the hands of Neil Blomkamp there. So that's going to be District 9 over on the Patreon page within the next few days, and that is going to do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, my sacred fire will be this desert, I thought. It never stops burning, even at night, and the sand is warm beneath the surface. I can always come here when I need to, and my community will be my friends. Who else would come into the desert with me? That is love. Thanks for listening.